Welcome to our next in our series, in fact an ongoing series of HealthCast. This is produced by Mind Your Healthcast LLC. I'm Dr. Mayfield. Today we're going to be talking about another important issue of health, which has to do with water. Probably the most prevalent elements on the surface of the earth and inside our body both. Before it's finished, we hope to give you some important information that you should know and some interesting information from governmental agencies for the better or the worse. And we may be tossing some things in our useless rubbish and sometimes dangerous as we talk about it. And it may not all be government. There's a lot of hype out in the world now of water, because it opened up a whole new market of sales, and you're going to see some interesting things, and we're going to talk about some interesting things. But before we get into it, I want you to be aware that on our website there's products and there's books that we'll be showing, and also on our forum we'll be posting information related to some tests that you can do for yourself to give you some information about your own water. And if you choose to do something, how it's affecting the outcome. So you can go to the forum to find out those items, and then you can order them through our products and or book site, on our site. We're going to be talking today about the nature of water to begin with, and what constitutes good water, what does not constitute good water, and number two, what one can do to help correct it. So one of the first things that we're going to talk about is, and I hope I don't get in over my head in this water, but I thought we would talk about the whole idea of what is water. I'm sure most people think they know what it is, and I suppose from appearance they do. But we're going to go a step farther, and we're going to talk about some of the chemical aspects of it, and what would constitute pure water and what would constitute impure water and or unhealthy. Some impurity may not be so bad for your health, but some of them could be very deadly. Okay, so number one, I'm sure if there's any chemical formula that anyone has ever heard, it's H2O. Pretty much, if you say that, probably someone that hasn't even finished high school or maybe even grade school has heard the term H2O, and they know to what you're referring, which is water. A very simple molecule having two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen joined together to form a triangular shaped molecule, approximately 105.8 degree angle of the two hydrogen atoms joining the oxygen. They tend to form loose bonds, or what are called hydrogen bonds, meaning you have the molecule, which is H2O, and several H2O molecules can join together to form a large cluster. Now, it's not generally known, because when you look at water, water looks like water no matter what. But the fact is that it is actually all the time changing its internal structure, meaning there could be small clusters of 2, 3, 4, 5, or 8, 12, 20, 30 molecules of water joined together, and there could be 300 clusters joined together, and when you looked at the water you wouldn't be able to tell a difference. But that those changes are going on constantly, and later when we talk about some things it might become apparent why that would be useful for the water to be like that. It's many times referred to as a universal solvent. So many things will dissolve in water, and when they do, they sometimes change the characteristics of the water. Probably by now, if you've lived very long in this world, you know that water can tend to form at least 3 different states or phases. Sometimes those are referred to in the world of chemistry as phases. The normal phase that we all see and think about normal as in our everyday life is the liquid state. And the liquid state, it's interesting because these states are temperature dependent. It means that the normal state of water, which is the liquid state, the one we use every day, if it's between 33 degrees Fahrenheit and 211 degrees up to almost 212 degrees Fahrenheit, it's in the liquid state. If for some reason the temperature drops and it drops down to 32, a phase transition begins, which means water begins to change from a liquid state to a crystalline state or solid state. And we call that ice. Now, ice, in order to form, has to give up some of its energy in the form of heat. Here in Florida, the growers of the citrus, when we have a very bad cold spell and a freezing spell, will actually turn on their sprinklers, which might sound counterproductive to the average person, but what it means is that when they spray the water on the plants just at the time it's really starting to freeze, as the ice forms on the tree leaves and on the tree limbs, it turns into ice and gives off heat, which actually keeps the product from being frozen, which could even be the fruit. And so it's actually productive to spray the water on and let it freeze on the tree or on the fruit. Now, if we go the other direction and we start heating the water, when we reach about 212 degrees, all of a sudden something happens. It starts to come apart. It's no longer a liquid. It turns into a vapor and becomes invisible. That starts out as steam, which is very dense vapor, but then as it dissipates into the air, it turns into steam. Or into vapors which become invisible and fills the air depending on the source of the water molecules. To the average person that doesn't mean too much, except you wouldn't want to have your hand in the steam because that's a nasty burn to get scalded with hot steam. However, water in the air creates an interesting problem for people who are flying airplanes because contrary to, again, what you might think, if you have water molecules in the air at a higher level, it causes the air to become lighter or thinner because the water displaces the air molecules. Now, the bad thing about that is that airplane wings require dense air to lift properly, so if you have a lot of water in the air, it causes the air to become lighter. The airplane doesn't lift as fast, so you have to have a longer run and you can lift at a slower rate. That's referred to as density altitude. Anybody who's a pilot would be well aware of that. So actually, cold dry air is better having less water in it. The airplane lifts faster and can carry the weight off the ground sooner. So all those are some of the basic things that we're aware of about water, and as I say, those different states are referred to as phases. Now, a phase is interesting because there's some unusual things about that sometime down the road when we get into chaos theory we'll probably talk about. Today it's beyond what we're going to be talking about. Now, you probably know, and I'm sure you've heard it. If you haven't, then it's good information to have, that our body, on the average, runs about 60 to 70% water. Sometimes, in certain people, it could be up much higher if you're retaining water or fluid in the body, as it's sometimes referred to, or as edema. You could have more in the body than the 70%. But on the average, it's plus or minus 70%, but in a few cases, toward dehydration, it could get down to 60. The brain always likes to maintain a 70%, and probably the body would protect the brain by keeping the water level up there, even if the rest were dehydrated. There's an interesting principle in physiology of the body, and that is that the body will always protect the brain at the expense of other parts of the body or organs if necessary to keep it alive. So there's actually a hierarchy of organs that the body will let go of and still try to protect or save the brain. Now, why is water so important in the body? Well, one of the major things is, of course, enzyme activity, and everything that takes place in the body, in some way, it utilizes enzymes, whether the enzymes are intracellular or extracellular, or in the gastric tract. Those enzymes require certain basic conditions to work properly. In fact, they have 3 conditions that they require. One happens to be water. There has to be a certain amount of water present for an enzyme to work. Number 2 is temperature, and number 3 is pH. Those things all have to be proper for things to work. An example, in the stomach, for the enzyme pepsin to work, which happens to be the area where the first stage of digestion takes place for proteins. The enzyme pepsin requires water, and it requires being warm, which is the body heat, and it requires the right pH for pepsin to work. Now, many people think the hydrochloric acid in the stomach is actually what breaks down the protein or does digestion of some sort. But the fact is it does not. All that the hydrochloric acid does is provide the proper pH for the enzyme to work. So between the right pH and the water, the enzyme pepsin breaks large complex protein molecules apart into what are called peptides, or which are chains of amino acids. Hence the enzyme got its name, the peptase. That is going to break it down into the peptide chain so that when it gets into the small intestine, the other enzymes, which are also proteases, but they break down the amino acid chains or peptides into amino acids for the body to use to rebuild and to do all kinds of things that are necessary, make hormones, make other enzymes that work in the body, and so forth. So it becomes very important that take place. Now, what are some of the characteristics of a good pure water? Well, if you have water that has been triple distilled, which is in chemistry, if you're going to use water for experiments, which also requires water in most cases, it requires a very pure water, meaning there's nothing in it. And so the process they use is called triple distillation. That means that they are going to distill it and take the distilled water they got from the process and run it through a distillation again, and then a third time. Usually they'll also run it through carbon filters to pull out air dissolved in the water, as well as solvents of various sorts, which means organic chemicals. There will be no minerals in that water if it's perfectly pure, and it will not conduct electricity. I had considered doing a little demonstration. I think down the road in some of our programs we'll do some actual demonstrations. I think we have to change our camera setup and several other things to make that happen, but I think that will be interesting. But if you put two wires connected to a light bulb and a battery into water that's totally pure, it will not conduct electricity. It's an insulator, actually. What it requires are what are called mineral ions. So if you drop a little table salt, which isn't really salt, it's a chemical called sodium chloride, and drop it into water, it will disassociate, meaning the sodium will separate from the chloride and form ions. Now, those ions are unbalanced with electrons, and so when you then put a wire in that's moving electrons, the light bulb will light, and it's kind of interesting. You stir in a little salt and it will light, but without that, it will not light the light. So basically, if you're talking pure water, then that's what you're going to have, and you're probably going to have a fairly high surface tension, which is something that means that the water has to do with wetness, actually. We're not going to get into that much today, but surface tension is an important factor with water when you're washing clothes or dishes and so forth. You want something that makes the water wetter. Now you'd say, how can you make water wetter? There is a way of doing that, and that is with detergents, which have a tendency to reduce surface tension and therefore allow the water to penetrate better. So everybody thinks it's the suds in the dishwashing detergent, which is incidentally not soap. It is a detergent, and detergents are wetting agents. So when you put the detergent in, it makes the water wetter, and it makes the water penetrate deeper into the fiber easily, and therefore to wash out the dirt. Just a little extra chemistry we threw in. Chemistry has always been fascinating to me. I've enjoyed it, and when you understand the chemistry of how things work, it all makes sense, but it's intriguing to know what's really going on. So many things that we just take for granted. Okay, we want to talk a little bit about healthy water. What is healthy water? Well, we've given you some of the characteristics of water, and it's interesting because when the body is building energy in the cells, in the mitochondria, the final byproduct of energy building and metabolic function is that the various nutrients go through a series of steps and ultimately down the respiratory chain combine with oxygen to produce ATP, which are the energy molecules, which are storage batteries that are in the muscles or in the cells of the body, to make energy so the body can carry on various functions. But anyhow, the end result of a healthy metabolism, and I say healthy because cancer doesn't do it that way. Healthy metabolism is that the oxygen is utilized along with the nutrient that have been exposed to various biochemical steps, produces a lot of ATP energy, and at the outcome or the end of the respiratory chain, you get two things. You get carbon dioxide and you get pure water. Those are the two end products. The pure water is used within the cell and it can be used throughout the body. And that water at that point is non-contaminated. It is just pure chemical water. Of course, the carbon dioxide passes out, goes back into the blood, goes to the lungs, and is expelled out of the body in exchange for more oxygen to come back in to carry on more energy production in the cells. So that's your minor course in cellular metabolism and biochemistry. Anyhow, we want to find out more about the water, and we need to go to France to begin with, because in France there was a hydrologist by the name of Professor Vincent, who was hired by the French government. And what they wanted him to do is they were aware that more and more we were going to public water supplies. Now, what does going to public water supplies means? It means we take water from the ground, rivers, or whatever our source is, and we expose it to a treatment process, a water treatment process. We run it through filters. We may sometimes add some chemicals to it to precipitate out certain chemicals. We throw in some chlorine to kill any bugs. Because, you know, after all, we need to be in the bug killing business, so we want to kill all those bugs and get them out of there. And then sometimes they throw in our modern times, something called fluoride. Fluoride has a long story within itself, and we won't get into that very heavily. But chlorine is an extremely toxic gas, but it's added to the water. There are other ways it could be done, even cheaper, but we're all built around this country to use chlorine, and a lot of the other countries around the world, so chlorine is the one they use. If you ever see chlorine, you see that it's kind of a greenish yellow gas. If you smell it, get it in your lungs, it's very suffocating, and in fact it could be fatal if you get very much. I know of one case, and I'm sure there's many. This lady went in her bathroom, decided to clean the bathroom, and she took ammonia and mixed it with Clorox to make a strong cleaning agent, filled the bathroom with chlorine, and they found her dead sometime later. Not a good mixture to mix together. But anyhow, that's how dangerous chlorine can be. It can be fatal. You've probably heard on the news on occasion where a plant that is either manufacturing or in some way utilizing chlorine has had a leak, and they had to not only evacuate the plant, but in many cases a whole section of town, because the chlorine gas is so toxic. There's been cases where railroad cars have carrying chlorine have been derailed and cracked open, and they had to again evacuate everyone because of it's such a nasty molecule. Or actually it's an atom, but it can form into molecules of chlorine. But it's so nasty that it's very corrosive. Fluoride, it's interesting, I'll just throw this in, that fluoride was very seldom encountered until we got into the manufacture of aluminum in this country. And once we did, it ended up that a byproduct of aluminum manufacture was sodium fluoride, was a chemical that was left over. The chemical sodium fluoride is so toxic that the federal government had extremely strict guidelines of disposal. It had to be put in certain containers with the skull and crossbones and say, deadly poison. Do not touch, do not handle. And it cost those companies a lot of money to dispose of that. Along the way, by scam and merchandising and some clever advertising, they were able to sell the dentists and the government and the public on the idea that that fluoride was necessary for healthy teeth. So now, instead of having to pay millions of dollars every year to dispose of an extremely toxic chemical, they just put it in everybody's toothpaste and in the drinking water, and the dentists brush it on the teeth of people to treat their teeth with fluoride and think nothing of it. However, it likewise is extremely toxic. So anyhow, they knew about this, and they hired Professor Vincent to go out and to measure the water and to look at the health records of all these major cities around the world. Ultimately, got to the U.S., everywhere. When he was finished with his study, he had an interesting conclusion that once he saw that a country had like a very low death rate from heart attacks and cardiovascular problems and a very low problem and death rate with cancer, when they went to public water supply, there was a tremendous increase in the number of deaths both from cardiovascular and from from the cancer. So both of those increased tremendously by going to public water supply. Now, it's interesting because his study wasn't just did they go to a public water supply, but he also studied the population to see if there was any other significant change that had taken place. So when he was done with this study, it was pretty definitive that if you took that treated water and started drinking it as opposed to natural water coming from the ground, that it increased your death rate both to cancer and cardiovascular problems. Now, in light of all that, however, nothing has changed. We still use chlorine and we still use fluorides. There's a few places in the world have decided it's too poisonous to put in the water. We don't have time to get into it today, but there are studies out there that show how it affects the brain, how it accelerates aging in the body. It not only destroys the brain physically, but it actually impairs the function of the brain. In fact, people become zombie-like. Guess who found out about that many years ago? In Nazi Germany. They discovered, the Nazi Party did, in their research, what fluoride would do. If you drank it in your water, it would make you much more docile and very much easier to control. You would lose your aggressiveness. And so when they got into World War II and they had the prison camps, it worked out very well to keep the population from resisting and creating problems. They did two things. The other one was, of course, they pulled away the fatty acids from their diet, and they died from fatty acid deficiency very rapidly, even though they were feeding them boiled potatoes and water. And they were feeding them fluorides so that their brain was not reacting very well, so that people just acted like a herd of sheep and were herded any way they want and gave very little resistance. The only exception to that would be Hogan's Heroes, and, and they resisted all the time, and convinced the commandant that they were the best prisoners that you could have because they never had an escape from the Stalag. Anyhow, had to throw a little humor in there. So, at any rate, Vincent did all these studies. Now, around the same time, over in Germany, we had a doctor by the name of Franz Morel. And he was an MD, but he was into more natural medicine. He used homeopathic medicine, got into nutrition, used the Schnitzer diet, and when we're talking about diets at some point, we'll probably talk about that. Got rid of his diabetes. He had been on insulin, went on the Schnitzer diet and was able to get off of his insulin, and his blood sugar went back to normal. So we'll talk about that when we talk about diets. But at any rate, he saw some of the work of what Professor Vincent was doing, and he realized that water being important to your health, and also the function of the body being important to maybe determine if you could use the same equipment that he had developed for the water to determine something about the health of the body. They got together and they began to do some studies. And they developed a system called BEV, which is Bioelectronic Vincent, named after Professor Vincent. Later it has come to this country to a degree. It was originally called BTA, Biological Terrain Analysis, and then the name was changed to Quantitative Fluid Analysis, and there was some attempted studies on it under a DRG protocol with university, but some interesting things happened out of that. But in any case, it was called BAV in Germany, and it became, once they established the parameters, a very good test for your state of health. And what they did was they measured the 3 fluids in the body, the blood, urine, and saliva, and from those they were able to know what the correct readings would be if the blood was proper with certain factors, and if the saliva was, and if the urine was. They couldn't use any of those separately because they all 3 had a relationship to each other, and if you're really going to have a test that gave you a good status report of the health of the body, then this was a good test to do that, and it was very objective. What it ended up was that they measured 3 factors electronically. And later we're going to be doing a program on the electricity and the electronics of the body, and we will go more into detail in this test and what it means. So today I'm not going to say a whole lot other than to say the 3 parameters that they ended up measuring were, they measured pH, which has to do with the concentration of hydrogen ions. They measured electrons, and they called it RH2, which was a measure of the amount of electrons that were present. And they measured the conductivity or resistance. They wanted to know how many ions that conduct electricity were present in each of those 3 fluids. And what they found out by doing a lot of studies, and when I say a lot, at the time I was in Germany and studied about it, they had done over 1 million tests. Dr. Morell measured everyone who came into his office. In fact, while we were there, we were measured. And so he drew blood, took saliva sample and urine sample, and measured those 3 factors, the protons, electrons, and ions in each of those 3 fluids. From that, you could tell whether somebody was in a healthy state, or if they weren't, in what direction they were moving, even to the point if their body was ready to quit and drop dead. There was a point in those numbers that would say this person is ready to die. There's probably nothing more can be done. The interesting thing about it is that in the U.S. population and all of the modern industrialized cultures or countries around the world seem to all be moving toward the 3rd quadrant of the 4 quadrants of this test. And within the 3rd quadrant, the 2 big things that it indicates is, number 1, cardiovascular thrombosis, number 2, cancer. And the further you are into that quadrant, the sicker you are, and there is a point called Krebs irreversible in German, which means cancer that cannot be turned around. And that's when Dr. Morell says you send the patient back to some other doctor and let them put in a hospital and die there because they're ready to go. I've only seen it once in advance of somebody and people that have come to me, but I had one that we measured. I was doing the same type of measurements, and when I looked at the report, even before I saw the patient, one part of the indicator was in advanced incurable cancer, and the other part of the indicator was to true death. When the lady came in and I started taking a history, I found out that she had metastatic cancer and had been told that it was terminal. And she came in one time, and that the reading was so bad on that, even though we put her on some things, she didn't survive. She didn't last long. And so it proved to me that it was a good indicator of these kind of problems. So anyhow, Dr. Morell is one of the doctors that I studied with on numerous occasions in Germany. And so myself and several other doctors purchased the equipment. Dr. Morell had gotten together with a company called the Medtronic Company in Germany, and they produced a piece of equipment. The original equipment came out of France, but sometimes it wasn't reliable, and Dr. Morell always had to have at least one extra unit in his office because many times they would have problems with it. And so he went to the Medtronic Company, and they designed a new unit which worked extremely well. So on the trip that I was in Germany learning about that, we set up a program to purchase those pieces of equipment, and Dr. Morell came to this country. In fact, he came to my office, which at the time was in Winter Park, and doctors from all over the country and a few out of the country came to my clinic, and we had almost 50 doctors who were trained in the use of the BEV. We brought some patients in, and they did the various tests on them, and it worked out very well, and I've utilized that program for a long time. Since then, the computerization of it has improved, so it is easier and faster and gives some nice graphic printouts of where you are, and included in that test was a determination of something called biological age. It would tell you how old you are compared to what your actual calendar years are. And many times I had people in their 30s would end up that their biological age would be 60, 70, 80, and in a few cases up to 90. And that means that the body is so far out of balance that you're actually equal to somebody that age. What we did find that the therapy that I was using, and we retested, the people's age would come back down into range where it should be. In fact, it's been a while since I've tested myself, but the last time I tested myself, I was approximately 30 years younger on the biological aging from the program than what my actual age was. So it's very interesting, good program, can give you a lot of good information. But they also, as I say, it started with water, and so Dr. Morell continued to measure the water that people was drinking with it. And in this country, that became one of the uses to the few doctors who got the equipment. They could measure water and tell whether it's healthy water or not. And in so doing, what they would do is they would measure the 3 factors that I mentioned about in water, and then they would come up with a wattage factor that either it's a good water that's going to be beneficial, or it's actually going to be a water that can be detrimental to your body. It actually can make you sicker. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But we know how important water is in the body. And we know that there's so many areas or compartments in the body that uses it, and it's very important. And you're going to see on our book list, there's a doctor from, I believe, Iran originally, that has done nothing but study water for years and years. And he wrote his first book was called The Body's Many Cries for Water. And he talks about how many symptoms the body can develop when there's a problem with water, either not enough, or of course in many cases if the water is poison that you're drinking and is creating some tremendous health problems. I believe that his book and the second book, he came out with a second book later, those 2 books are extremely good to tell you a little bit about hydration. Now, he did a lot of studies of elderly people in the hospitals, and he believes that a high percentage of the deaths that occur in the hospital occur because of dehydration. Dehydration, you reach a critical point where the body cannot carry on functions anymore if it doesn't have enough water. And so it's interesting, in the hospitals they have these helpers or aides that come around, and they put a container of water with a straw and a glass on the table besides an elderly patient. But if they are almost comatose, or they hardly can move, or they're hardly conscious, they come back later and take away that water, put another container of water there, and the person's had nothing to drink. And they will allow a patient to lay there, because no one's checking, are they drinking the water? They'll allow a patient to lay there and expire from dehydration. And that's what he found out, that a high percentage of hospital deaths of the elderly were from dehydration. Which tells you how important water is in the body. Because when you reach a critical level of deficiency, things start to shut down because they require it to work. Now it's in the body, and the body fluids, the brain, the blood, the lymph, the saliva, the matrix, which is the filler tissue in between, and it also is inside the cells. Not only inside, but inside the nucleus of the cell. Those all have to have water to function properly. Now, DNA is interesting because if it becomes dehydrated, the DNA molecule twists and actually deforms itself if it does not have enough water. It actually requires a layer of water to make it function properly. So you can imagine what type of mutations and difficulties could happen just because of dehydration alone. It's required for the synthesis of proteins in the body, and of course the body uses water to detox and flush things out. In the urine, it flushes them out. So we know pretty much how important it is, but the question is the water that we're drinking, is it suitable for what we need? Now there's some big factors in water that has come about because of modern living. As I say, we've synthesized since World War II so many chemicals of the organic nature that has made the chemical companies and the pharmaceuticals a fortune. But unfortunately, those contaminants getting in water are not very good. Some of you have probably heard of studying various output of water treatment plants and finding a high number of prescription drugs in the water that's going out for people to drink. Pesticides are showing up. Herbicides are showing up. Industrial wastes are showing up. And many times sewage is showing up in the water because of the contamination level and the way it's processed. So those are all just the organic contaminants that are in the water. Recent studies with infants all the way up to adults, anywhere from 200 to 300 organic chemicals circulating in the blood. So how are they getting in? They're either going to come from the air, they're going to come from the food, or they're going to come from the water. And the water is one of the main sources of bringing all those contaminants in. Many years now, they've been burying huge containers of toxins in the ground to get rid of them. And what happens? They found that in many cases, the drums have rusted. It's leaking now into the aquifers, and people are drinking it. I know in Atlantic City, one of their major aquifers is so toxic, they had to shut it down as a source of water to drink. It became too expensive to even try to detoxify all of that material out of the water. So there's a tremendous amount of organic toxins that have been added over the years. And then there are the inorganic. As the water moves through the ground, it depends on the nature of the ground. In Florida, there's a tremendous amount of calcium compounds that get into the aquifer here. Calcium carbonate, calcium sulfate, calcium phosphate, and a lot of other minerals can get into the water and be a big problem. But of course, Florida has another problem because of all the citrus growers over the years, and tomato growers and so forth. All of the pesticides and herbicides that have been sprayed have eventually soaked into the ground and have also gotten into the water supplies in Florida. So you have inorganic, which usually are hard minerals, and that's going to become important because a little bit later we're going to talk about ways of purifying water. The inorganic chemicals are the hard minerals that get in water. Now, I know a lot of people think you need to get your minerals out of water, so you should never get rid of those minerals. However, my finding has been over about 30-some years of clinical experience, and others that I know likewise doing the same thing, that if you drink water high in those hard minerals, guess where it ends up? In your urine. It comes back out because the body doesn't want to use it. So they are not the best source of minerals at all. In fact, the plants that we eat should be where we should be getting the minerals. They should be bringing the minerals out of the ground and incorporating them into the structure of the plants. And when we eat them, we should be getting those minerals in an organic form that our body can absorb. I don't know how much you know about that, but basically in healthy soil and a healthy plant that hasn't been destroyed by either pesticides or some type of herbicide, or sometimes the ammonia that's sprayed to try to put more nitrogen in so the plants will grow faster and look bigger. there is at the root of a healthy plant a bacteria that grows synergistically with the plant that produces something called humic acids. Humic acids are of a couple of types, but one in particular is called fulvic acid. Now, fulvic acid actually chelates the minerals out of the clay and soil and puts them in an ionized form that they can be absorbed into the plant. And once they're absorbed into the plant, we eat the plant, we get them in that same bound form and take them into our bodies. And so the fulvic acid helps them be absorbed into our body. And at the same time, once it's released the mineral, it can pick up some toxins and flush out of the body. So it actually contributes a dual purpose. So in any case, well, that's where we want to get our minerals. And I'm saying that now because as we talk about some of the purification and the minerals being removed, some people get very disturbed and think you got to get those minerals out of your water, which is not true. In fact, we have behind us here the useless rubbish bin, and that's one of those things that should be tossed into the bin, is the idea that we have to get our minerals from our water. We don't. In fact, one of the purest mineral or waters in the world in bottled form, and a lot of people turn to bottled water because they think that the tap water is too contaminated, so they'll go to bottled water. Well, many of those are worthless too, and also should go in the garbage bin. There's a few of them that are not bad. When I was in Germany, Dr. Morel and other doctors that were part of his group took all the bottled waters from everywhere in the world they could find, and they tested them with this equipment, the BEV equipment. And they only found a few that were decent. Even one of the famous ones that comes out of France, or more than one, but Perrier, was considered to be, you drink Perrier if you want to drink really good water. Interestingly, for two reasons. Number one, Perrier comes out of the ground with carbon dioxide in it, but they remove the carbon dioxide, and then they have to treat it to purify it somewhat. And then they add carbon dioxide back into it. So the bubble that you get from the sparkling water of Perrier is actually just carbon dioxide gas that they put in the water. Anyhow, when they tested it on this equipment, it tested to be one of the worst waters to drink. There's several others that fall in that category. The top one in the whole world that they found was one called Catal Rock. You can't get it in this country. In Germany, it is so well known for being so beneficial to the body that many regular medical doctors, as well as chiropractors, which are naturopaths in Germany, use it therapeutically because it has such a powerful effect to correct things in the body. When I was on one of my trips there, I bought some of it to drink. They only put it in glass, and that's why they don't ship it here, because it won't take the shipping. But anyhow, it just had a very unique feel, almost like it just soaked right into your body when you drank it and made you feel very good. It actually quenched your thirst very rapidly. So I was very impressed with it. Catal Rock, but we can't get it here. There's several that have been brought over here. There's a few that aren't bad, but actually, bottled water is probably not the way to go. First of all, it's expensive, and secondly, many of the waters on the market are useless, and in some cases, like the one from Coca-Cola, they found that it was coming from the tap. They admitted they just ran it from the tap and filled the bottle. So I'm not saying anything secret. It was in the news that they admitted that it was nothing but tap water. But because everybody was buying bottled water and paying a premium, they thought they better get in the market. So it cost them pretty much nothing to make it, and they made a lot of money from it. And what happened to them? I don't think much of anything, if anything, happened, even after they admitted it. Now, they were claiming that it was purified, but yeah, it was by the public chlorine and fluorine, but not very good for our bodies. That one would definitely go in the useless and even dangerous rubbish. So the third contaminant, we didn't talk about it yet, but we will, is biological. Now, what does that mean? That means living organisms. Could be viruses, which is not really an organism, but a piece of bad information. It could be cysts for microparasites, like, well, there's several out there. Giardia lamblia, I guess, is one of the big ones that people can get poisoned with. And Cryptosporidia is another one that the cysts or the eggs are so small that you can't see them. They get in the water, and the water treatments normally don't do anything to get rid of them. The chlorine doesn't even seem to affect them. And so those you can pick up, and there's other contaminants that can get in of a biological nature. And so a good method would get rid of all those if you really wanted to purify the water. And so those are something that we're having to contend with in your public water supply, as a rule, contrary to being defended by cities and many times states and even the federal government. In most cases, if you want to say, yeah, it's free of certain bacterial forms, because they put a lot of chlorine in, yes. Is it free of the cysts and the viruses? No, because the chlorine, unless it's a massive amount, would not get rid of the virus. And it certainly is not going to get rid of those some of those eggs either that are in there that create these microparasites. I've had patients who go traveling and they many times come back sick with a terrible diarrhea. And basically, those are what they can pick up. Those can get into actually the bile ducts and the gallbladder and become a big issue. Now, we're down to the whole idea of water purification. But as we get into that, I thought it was interesting that I was looking at what's happening in water and water quality today. And I found that there's a big news release. This is from the the Health and Human Services and the EPA. Great news. They have reviewed the factor of fluorides being toxic versus the necessity of fluorides to retard tooth decay. And they have decided that the old numbers that they've been using, which was 1.2 milligrams down to 0.7 milligrams per liter, they needed to revise that a little. And so, put on your rose-colored glasses. They've done something big for you. They reduced it down to only 0.7 or lower, but they're still going to allow it to be put in. Good news, however, it probably should go in the useless rubbish until they take it all out. Now, there's a huge amount of reports out on chlorine and chlorination and what it does to drinking water. When we take a look at that, it says that, well, when chlorine enters water, it reacts chemically with any organic matter found in water. Good piece of information. Now, we don't have to worry, though, if there's no organic material there. They can't react to it. However, now that's not talking about the poisonousness of chlorine in general. We're only talking about what it might do to organic matter. However, the bad news is that there is always some organic matter in even natural waters. So to put chlorine in there, guess what? It forms something called a trihalomethane, or THM for short. One of those is chloroform, and that's what you then end up with in your drinking water if they treat it with chlorine. Now that's some pretty good information. I think we'll keep that one. However, the whole problem is that there are other ways they could, if they even wanted to purify water without using chlorine, that it's even less expensive. But they would have to change a lot of the setups, and they don't want to do that. Besides that, there's too many big companies making too much money off of chlorine production. So they certainly wouldn't want to interrupt that. So we're probably not going to see too much happen with that for a while yet. There's just one city I saw of, which was actually, this one's in Massachusetts, and they decided to go to ozone as a treatment. And they reduced their cost like $83 per million gallons of water, which is only 1/3 of what it costs to use chlorine for. That's pretty good information. U.S. drinking water contains more than 2,100 toxic chemicals that can cause cancer. Now that's pretty good information. But then we can't get rid of all those toxic chemicals, again, because too many people are making too much money from them. So we certainly wouldn't want to interfere with commerce. Okay, in fact, we should put our rose glasses on for that. They're making lots of money. Okay, so now what do we want to talk about now? We want to talk about some ways to purify water that you can do. There's two ways you can purify water. One is at the point of entry. That's when it comes into your house, period. In other words, the water supply coming in. Or number two, the point of use. That is, at the point where you're actually going to drink it or you're going to use it to cook your food or whatever. Most of the processes involve the point of use. In other words, in your kitchen. The three main methods that have been out for quite some time are filtration, and distillation, and reverse osmosis. Now, each of those are going to claim that theirs are perfectly fine and do the best job. Mostly, the filtration systems are probably next to worthless. What they do is they take some big lumps and chunks out. If they've got a carbon filter attached, they may absorb a few of the dissolved gases, maybe a little of the chlorine, maybe a little bit of the organic chemicals, but only a little bit, not all. And by taking out some of the chlorine, they'll probably improve the taste a little bit. They don't take out any of the hard minerals, they don't take any of the other things out, but they'll take some pretty good sized lumps out. But most of them, sometimes if you have a very high quality ceramic, you may take out most of the larger bacterial forms and eggs and cysts, but not the viruses, not the fluoride, and certainly not the organic chemicals. You'll only pick a very small amount of that out by filtration. So the ones that they set on the countertop, you pour the water through, or the ones that attach to your faucet, outside of removing a little chlorine and maybe not making it taste quite as objectionable, it does little more for the water as far as actually purifying it. As I say, it is a filter, and that's what it does. It filters out some things, but that's about it. The next method is distillation. Now, prior to the release of the special membranes that had been developed in space and high-level research, reverse osmosis was not available to the public, so distillation became the other major source. You either filter the water or you distill it. Distillation means you put the water in a pot and you boil it, and as it boils it forms steam. You go through a phase transition from a liquid to a gas, and the steam goes up through the condenser is called, and the condenser is cooled by being surrounded by cold water, and when it comes out the other end, the steam condenses back to water. Now, what it leaves behind are the hard minerals that were in the water, and you can tell that if you had a distiller before. You see all this hard, crusty stuff that's left in the heating chamber, and you've taken out some of the solvents, but not necessarily all. That's why I said in chemical pure water, CP for chemically pure, it requires that you triple distill and that you carbon filter. So by triple distilling, then you get rid of pretty much all of that, or what's left is such a low level that it's not quite a problem, but very impractical for home use. So most home distillers do not triple distill. They do it one time, and so you still end up with a lot of stuff carried over of the organic solvents and organic compounds. And the boiling, of course, would get rid of bacterial forms and probably the viruses and so forth. So one-time distillation is still better than drinking tap water and still better than filtration. There was a company for a while who built what was called a fractional distiller. I used to have one of those in my office, and that's probably the best distiller to use for home if you can find one. A fractional distiller, I haven't found another one to replace the one I had. A fractional distiller actually takes off the distillate at different temperatures. At the lower temperature, the volatiles, such as pesticides, herbicides, organic chemicals, they turn into a vapor faster. So those are distilled off first, and they come out as separate exit. Then as the water gets hotter and goes up to the steam, by that time these organic chemicals have been distilled off, and now the water vapor goes up to a higher level and is actually comes out a different port, and that probably is the best single distiller you can get. As I say, if you can find one, that would be the one to get for home use. However, I feel that reverse osmosis is probably the best that you can get for home. And the reason being that it uses a membrane that is so fine that it takes all the minerals out of the water. It takes all of the pesticides, herbicides, and chemicals out. And it takes pretty much all the fluorine out. That's a small molecule, but it still takes it out. Or atom, I should say. It takes it out. And pretty well takes all the chlorine, everything out. And on one run through this reverse osmosis membrane, plus they usually have pre and post carbon filters, what comes out of the faucet from that is probably about as pure as you can get for home. Now back when I was in my early days of doing this type of work, there were not, the reverse osmosis wasn't available. We had to go with distillation, and so we had to work on ways to get it as clean as possible. And I remember one of the very first things would happen when somebody would come into my office and I would say, you're going to have to quit drinking tap water, you're going to have to drink distilled water. They would say, well, I can't drink distilled water, it's going to leach all the minerals out of my body and I need to get the minerals from the water, which I mentioned earlier is not true. And number two, I've known people who were on it 20 and 30 years, drank nothing but distilled water, and they weren't leaching the minerals out of the body. In fact, they were very healthy. And we also did tests in the urine, and those hard minerals were not showing up in the urine. But guess what? If you drank a mineral water or you drank tap water that had a lot of hard minerals, when you tested the urine, those would be high in the urine. So the body was throwing them out. So that wasn't true. I was looking at some of my research, and I ran across that this one doctor put a report out that he said that if you drink distilled water, you're going to produce an early death. He called it. Early death comes from regular drinking of distilled water. And so a gentleman who does a lot of research with health challenged him on that. He wrote him a big paper and said, where's all the research that shows that this is true? And as far as I know, the gentleman never responded to it. But those people who read that report said, oh yeah, that doctor said you can't do it because it's going to take all the stuff out of your body if you drink distilled water. So anyhow, distilled water is okay if it's done properly and you get everything out, but my recommendation is reverse osmosis, and I know we're getting down toward the end. I've only been able to scratch the surface. As usual, there's a lot more to it. Now, I will get back on the water because we are going to do a session a little later where we will be talking about the Vincent method, the VEV, and how important those pieces of information are to health. We're going to be talking about now. Something we didn't get to touch on much today was the alkalizers. You know, there's been a big move in this country. Drink alkaline water. You've got to neutralize all that acid in the body. I would have to say, here's a report of about 50 pages called The Benefits of Alkaline Water, and I have the favorite place for that is going to be in the useless information. If you want to make yourself sick and you want to really get into that third quadrant of BEV where cancer and thrombosis are, try and alkalize the body too much, and that's what's going to happen. And I'll be able to show you that when we get into the BEV on one of our future shows. So don't run out and spend $4,000 for one of these units that alkalizes the water at 9.5, because 9.5 is up close to where the liquid plumber and the oven cleaners are in alkalinity, and I don't think you want to be putting that stuff in your body. In fact, if you know anything about chemistry, you know what they use to clean skeletons of all the muscle debris and the connective tissue that's left on the skeleton. They put it in a lye bath, which is alkalinity. And alkaline breaks apart and destroys protein. I don't think you want to get your body too alkaline because you're going to shut down your enzyme systems, you're going to shut down your energy production, and you're going to put yourself in a very serious health state. That's my opinion. You may or may not agree, but I have reasons why, and when we do the BEV, we're going to go into that in detail. But before you go out and spend $2,000 to $4,000 for an alkaline producing machine, I would give it some serious thought, and I would look at a lot more research before you decide to jump into it. Anyhow, the things that I recommend you will find on the website, even some RO units, reverse osmosis, and books about them, and how to test your water, and how do you make sure the water is balanced. And I want you to know that the body, human body, keeps urine, saliva, and blood very close to the 7 point in pH, which is neutral. Slightly acid is the saliva and urine, and slightly alkaline is the blood. And if you run the blood alkalinity up, you put yourself into a cancer zone. And when we get into that, we'll talk to it in detail. Anyhow, it was nice to visit with you again. We'll be coming back next week after this with another exciting one. I think we're going to get more into putting them in the useless rubbish bin or the dangerous rubbish bin. I think we probably need two. But we want you to start thinking about your health. And don't forget, if you have questions, go to our forum, leave the questions or comments. And our website is mindyourhealth.com, and in the site map, you can click forum and go directly to the forum, and you can leave your questions, comments, and criticisms, and we'll be happy to hear them. It was nice to see you again. Until next time.